Beneath the quiet shimmer of the Egyptian moon, the desert never truly sleeps. The wind hums softly through the dunes, brushing against ancient stones that have watched over centuries of gods, kings, and secrets too sacred to be spoken aloud. There is a rhythm in that silence, a rhythm that once guided every heartbeat in the land of the Pharaohs, a rhythm of life, of death, and of creation. Tonight, we drift into that world, a place where power was not just worn as a crown or carved into monuments, but lived, breathed, and sometimes performed in rituals that blurred the lines between the divine and the human. For in ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was more than a ruler. He was a living god, believed to hold the pulse of the sun itself within his veins. His body was not his own. It was the vessel of the gods. Every act he made, even in his most private moments, was an echo of creation. The story you're about to hear is not one you'll find in most textbooks. It's a quiet, hidden chapter of history, one written in hieroglyphs along temple walls, hinted at in fragile papyri buried deep in the sand. And though the centuries have buried many of these truths, whispers still survive, stories of sacred unions, symbolic acts, and divine mysteries that once shaped an entire civilization. If you listen closely, perhaps you can still hear them. The distant chants of priests echoing through the corridors of Karnak. The soft rustle of linen as offerings are laid before a golden statue. The gentle trickle of the Nile outside, as moonlight glistens over its surface, carrying secrets from one temple to another. Long before Egypt became a land of kings and pyramids, it was a place of stories, stories of gods who loved, who fought, and who gave birth to the world. The people believed that creation itself began from an act of divine love, a sacred union that brought life out of the waters of chaos. Every pharaoh, in turn, carried that responsibility. To rule meant to recreate that act of balance, to ensure that life continued to flow. It was not enough to govern the people. A pharaoh had to please the gods, renew the cycles of fertility, and maintain the harmony between heaven and earth. And to do this, he often took part in rituals that to us may seem strange, even shocking, but to them were acts of cosmic importance. One such ritual was known as the Festival of Renewal, where the pharaoh, representing the god Osiris, symbolically reunited with his divine consort Isis. In the myths, Isis had brought her husband back from death through her devotion and sacred magic. In these ceremonies, the pharaoh became both god and man, bridging the realms of mortality and eternity. His union with the goddess was not merely symbolic. It was believed to rejuvenate all of Egypt, ensuring that the Nile would flood, the crops would grow, and the people would thrive. But how far did these acts go? What really happened behind the closed curtains of the temple's innermost chamber, where only the pharaoh and his priests could enter? The records are vague, the hieroglyphs often poetic, as if the ancient scribes themselves feared to write too plainly. But from fragments found across tombs and scrolls, historians believe that these rituals involved more than just prayers. They were reenactments, embodied expressions of divine myths. The pharaoh did not only pray for life, he performed it. In one account, written on a fragment discovered near Abydos, it is said that before a pharaoh received the priesthood, he would take part in a symbolic act meant to unite heaven and earth within his flesh. What that meant exactly remains a mystery. Some say it was a ritual bath. Others suggest something more intimate, an act performed under sacred guidance to embody creation itself. Egyptians viewed sexuality not as shameful, but as sacred. To them, it was life, pure, powerful, and divine. The act of union was a mirror of the cosmos, the meeting of sun and soil, sky and earth. It was a mystery to be celebrated, not hidden. And within this belief, the pharaoh's role became even more complex. His body was a symbol, his bloodline sacred. Even his offspring were believed to carry divine essence. This belief led to one of the most misunderstood customs in Egyptian royalty, the marriages between siblings. To modern minds, it seems strange, but to the ancients, it was a way of preserving divinity. The gods themselves, like Isis and Osiris, were siblings. So, too, were many pharaohs and their queens. Their unions were not seen as human indulgence, but as divine duty, an attempt to keep the sacred lineage pure, to maintain the balance of heaven within the royal bloodline. Inside the temple walls, art told these stories without words. On the walls of Dendera, Hathor, the goddess of love and beauty, is shown embracing her consort. In Luxor, the birth chamber of Amenhotep III displays scenes of the god Ammonius visiting the queen in disguise, blessing her womb so that her child would be born divine. These images were not erotic, they were holy. Every gesture, every curve, every line carved in stone was a prayer. But there were other rituals, darker and more secretive, spoken of only in whispers among the priests. Rituals said to be performed when the Nile ran low, when drought threatened the land, or when omens in the stars turned against Egypt. In these times, the pharaoh was believed to have to renew his strength in more unusual ways, by reenacting the most primal acts of the gods. Some texts mention offerings of sacred fluids, preserved and stored as symbols of fertility. Others describe ceremonies where animals, sacred to different gods, played a role in symbolic unions meant to restore cosmic balance. These were not acts of pleasure. They were acts of faith, expressions of a belief that everything in nature, from the smallest seed to the greatest king, was connected through the cycle of life and creation. Historians still debate how literal these practices were. Some argue they were purely metaphorical, enacted through statues, symbols, and ritual gestures rather than real acts. Others suggest that certain pharaohs, desperate to maintain divine favor, took the myths into their own hands, living out what had once been sacred story. Imagine it. A temple chamber lit only by the flicker of oil lamps, the air heavy with incense and myrrh. The pharaoh stands before a golden effigy of Hathor, her eyes made of polished lapis lazuli, glimmering in the candlelight. Around him, priests chant in low tones, their voices echoing off the stone walls. Every movement he makes is slow, deliberate, rehearsed through generations. To the outside world, this is ceremony. But to those within, it is creation reborn. As the ritual ends, the pharaoh steps out into the night, the stars reflecting on the Nile below. For a moment, the air feels still, as if the gods themselves are listening. Somewhere, far away, the croak of a frog, symbol of rebirth, echoes in the reeds. The ceremony is over, but the cycle has begun anew. For many Egyptians, these stories explained the very fabric of their world. To them, the body of the pharaoh was the bridge between gods and men. His acts shaped the fate of a nation. His failures could bring famine or flood. And so, everything about him, his birth, his marriage, his rituals, even his death, was wrapped in sacred meaning. Even in death, the pharaoh's connection to these divine acts continued. Tombs were decorated with scenes that mirrored the rituals of life, gestures of union, rebirth, and fertility. Some coffins even displayed delicate carvings that hinted at these themes, as if to remind the soul of its eternal duty to creation. The deeper archaeologists dig, the more they find. Strange inscriptions about seed offerings, mysterious jars preserved beside royal mummies, and hidden chambers that suggest rituals once took place within the pyramids themselves. Each discovery adds another layer to the mystery, a mystery that continues to haunt historians to this day. Who truly understood these rites? Were they the invention of powerful priests seeking to control belief, or genuine attempts by the pharaohs to embody their divine role? Did they believe that by performing such acts, they could command the gods, or perhaps become them? As we drift through this world, let the desert winds carry those questions into your dreams. Picture the golden temples, the calm waters of the Nile, and the quiet faces of stone gods watching over the land. Imagine standing among them, hearing the low hum of ancient prayers that once echoed through every chamber. Because in this story, there is no clear line between myth and memory, faith and desire. Only the whispers of a civilization that saw beauty power, and creation as one and the same. But somewhere, deep beneath the sands, there is said to be one scroll, a record of the final and most sacred ritual. A rite so mysterious that only one pharaoh dared perform it, and it changed Egypt forever. And that is where our story truly begins. The night over Luxor was still, the kind of stillness that makes every breath sound louder than it should. The sand lay quiet under the pale wash of moonlight, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, the Nile shimmered like a silver thread, winding its way through the dark. A single light flickered near the edge of an excavation site, a small tent glowing softly from within. Inside, among rolled papyri and fragments of stone, sat a young historian named Layla Hassan. Her eyes, weary yet alert, traced the delicate carvings on a limestone tablet she'd unearthed that morning. She wasn't searching for treasure. She was searching for truth. Layla had grown up listening to her grandmother's stories about the old gods, the ones who ruled before time itself. Stories of Osiris, who rose from death, of Isis, whose love restored him, of Ra, whose light created life anew each day. But what fascinated her most were the tales that never made it into history books, the ones that hinted at rituals too strange, too holy, or too scandalous for scholars to believe. When she was invited to join an excavation at the edge of the Valley of the Kings, she felt the pull of something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. Tonight, she thought she'd finally found it. The tablet before her was covered in faded hieroglyphs, faint, almost erased by time. But one phrase kept repeating itself: union of the sun and the earth, the divine renewal. Layla leaned closer, brushing away a layer of dust. Below the text, a carved figure appeared, a pharaoh, arms raised, standing between two deities. To one side stood Isis, to the other Hathor. Above them, a circle, the sun, shone over the pharaoh's crown. It wasn't unusual for Egyptian art to depict divine unions. But there was something different here. The pharaoh's name had been deliberately scratched out. Whoever had buried this tablet didn't want the world to remember who he was. Outside, the wind began to rise. The tent's fabric rippled softly as grains of sand brushed against it like whispers. Layla felt a strange chill, not from the cold, but from the sense that she was no longer alone. She turned off her lamp and listened. Nothing but the faint hiss of the desert. Then faintly a sound like a low hum, almost musical, drifting from somewhere beneath the ground. The excavation site sat above a collapsed chamber they hadn't yet entered. The team had marked it off as unsafe. But now the sound seemed to come from there, a slow, rhythmic pulse, as if the earth itself were breathing. Layla hesitated. Every rational thought told her to wait until morning. But curiosity has always been stronger than caution, especially when history whispers your name. She grabbed her lantern, stepped out into the night, and made her way toward the pit. The sand crunched beneath her boots. The stars above burned like ancient eyes. At the edge of the site, she paused, a faint line of rope marking the boundary between known and forbidden. She lifted it and stepped over. Her lantern light revealed a small opening in the ground, half covered by rock and dust. She knelt and brushed it aside, revealing the faint outline of a stone doorway, sealed for millennia. Across its surface were carvings unlike any she'd ever seen. Not the usual depictions of gods or battles, but something more symbolic: circles, flowing lines, and shapes that resembled the cycle of the sun. At the center, an image of the pharaoh again, the same one from the tablet, his name still missing, his eyes staring ahead as if watching her. Layla's heart beat slowly but firmly. She reached for her notebook and began sketching the symbols. Then, almost without thinking, she pressed her hand against the door. The stone was cool, unnaturally so. A faint vibration moved through her palm, like a pulse. The hum returned, louder now, rising from the ground beneath her feet. For a moment, she felt dizzy, as though the air around her had grown heavy. Then just as suddenly the sound stopped. In the silence that followed, the desert seemed to hold its breath. She stepped back. The hum was gone, but the memory of it lingered, like the echo of a voice she couldn't quite hear. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by her desk, reviewing her notes, replaying every detail in her mind. The missing name, the repeated symbols, the hum. There was something strange about this pharaoh, someone erased from history, but remembered by the desert itself. The next morning, her team returned. Under the blazing sun, they cleared away the entrance and prepared to open the sealed chamber. As the last stone was lifted, a rush of air escaped, stale, dry, ancient. It smelled faintly of cedar and resin. Inside, their flashlights illuminated a narrow passageway leading down into darkness. The walls were covered in inscriptions, and every few steps a new symbol appeared. Always the same circle within a circle, the mark of the sun. At the end of the tunnel stood a small room. In the center of it, a wooden coffin lay half-buried in sand. Around it, broken jars and offerings scattered like forgotten memories. But what drew Layla's attention wasn't the coffin, it was the wall behind it. Painted there, still vibrant after thousands of years, was a mural of a ceremony. It showed the pharaoh standing before a pool of water. Behind him, priests chanted. Before him, a golden statue of Hathor gleamed in the lamplight. And above them, in flowing hieroglyphs, a single line read, "He who unites the sun with the flesh brings life eternal." Layla stepped closer, her eyes tracing every line. The details were breathtaking, the robes, the offerings, the crown. But then she noticed something else. In the painting, the pharaoh's eyes were open. Not stylized, not abstract. Open, human, almost lifelike. It was as if he was still watching. A wave of unease swept through her. She looked down at the coffin. The lid was covered in carvings that matched the wall. The same sun symbols, the same phrases of renewal. But there was no name, no title, no cartouche. Whoever this pharaoh was, someone had gone to great lengths to erase his identity, yet preserve his ritual. That night, as the team cataloged their findings, Layla stayed behind. She couldn't stop thinking about the mural, about the eyes, about the hum she'd heard before. She returned to the chamber alone, her lantern flickering softly in the dark. The air was still. She knelt beside the coffin, tracing the symbols with her fingertips. And then she saw it, a small crack along the base of the wall. Inside, something glimmered faintly in the lantern light. She brushed away the sand and pulled out a thin roll of papyrus, sealed in wax. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The writing was faded but legible. It was a ritual text, one unlike any she'd ever seen. It spoke of the rite of rebirth, performed only once every 1,000 years by the living God King. It described how the pharaoh would merge his spirit with that of the goddess, ensuring the eternal cycle of life. But at the end of the scroll, a line stood out. "He who performs it alone shall awaken what should sleep." Layla's breath caught. The words were clear, deliberate, and chilling. She looked back at the mural, at the pharaoh's painted eyes. For a moment, she could swear they glimmered in the light. Somewhere deep in the tomb, a faint vibration began again. That same low hum, growing louder, closer. Layla froze. The air grew heavy. The lantern flame flickered wildly. Dust fell from the ceiling as the ground beneath her feet trembled ever so slightly. And then silence. She turned toward the coffin. The hum had stopped, but the lid, which had been sealed shut for millennia, now sat slightly ajar. Layla stared, her pulse slow but deep. The night air around her seemed to thicken, like the weight of centuries pressing down. She took a single step closer, the light trembling in her hand. From within the coffin, something shifted, softly, like fabric brushing against stone. Her lantern flickered once and went out. Darkness swallowed the chamber whole. And in that darkness, she heard a whisper, not in any modern tongue, but in the deep, melodic language of the ancients. It was the same rhythm she'd heard in the desert wind, the same voice that had hummed beneath the sand, the voice of the pharaoh. When morning came, the desert was golden again, calm and wide, as though nothing unusual had happened. The workers returned with baskets and brushes. unaware that something in the tomb below had stirred during the night. Layla sat by the riverbank, staring at her reflection in the slow-moving water. She hadn't slept. The sound she had heard, that whisper from the dark, still echoed in her mind, yet she could not prove it had happened at all. Perhaps it was only her imagination, she told herself, the exhaustion of long days and restless nights. But her hands still trembled, and when she thought of the coffin lid shifting, she felt the same quiet dread rise in her chest. The team leader, Professor Adler, noticed her silence. He was older, calm, a man who had spent his life among bones and broken stone. "You found something down there," he said softly. Layla hesitated. "Just a fragment of papyrus. It mentioned a rite of rebirth. I think this tomb belonged to a pharaoh erased from the records." Adler frowned. "Erased?" She nodded. "No name, no titles, only symbols. Someone wanted to hide him." The professor sighed, rubbing the dust from his glasses. "Then he must have done something the priests feared. In Egypt, forgetting was worse than death." They descended together into the chamber once more. The air was cool and dry, smelling faintly of incense that had long since faded. The others unpacked lamps and cameras, their voices low and careful. For Layla, every sound seemed too loud, the scrape of metal, the whisper of sand, as if the tomb itself was listening. The coffin stood unchanged, yet the crack along its lid was unmistakable. Layla crouched beside it, tracing the edge with her finger. It was no illusion. The stone seal had been broken from within. "Earth tremor," one of the workers said quickly, seeing her expression. "Happens sometimes. The ground shifts." But Layla wasn't so sure. She remembered the hum, the way it had stopped the moment the lid moved. Adler, unaware of her thoughts, directed the team to photograph the mural. "Every inch," he said. "These scenes are unique. They may tell us about a missing part of the royal cult." The lights illuminated the painted faces, frozen in their silent gestures. The pharaoh, arms raised to the heavens. The priests offering jars and flowers. The goddess, carved with such grace that even time had not dimmed her. Layla's gaze drifted again to the hieroglyphs that framed the mural. The phrases repeated: "The flesh renews the light. The seed awakens the sun." Each word carried the same undertone of creation and power, the eternal joining of opposites. She began copying them carefully into her notebook, her pen scratching quietly across the page. As she worked, something strange happened. The symbols seemed to flow together, as if one line led into the next in a rhythm she hadn't seen before. It wasn't just text. It was music, a pattern of sounds meant to be spoken aloud. "Professor," she murmured, "these aren't simple inscriptions. They're verses, like an invocation." Adler looked up. "Recitations for the ceremony, perhaps." "Yes," she whispered. "But some of these words aren't standard Middle Egyptian. They're older, almost pre-dynastic." That caught his attention. Older than the pharaohs themselves? Layla nodded slowly, as if whoever wrote this was reaching back to the beginning of belief itself. Later that evening, after the others had gone, she sat outside the tomb entrance, notebook in her lap, reading the words over and over. The wind moved softly around her, carrying the smell of the river and the faint call of night birds. She spoke the first line aloud, barely above a whisper. The syllables felt heavy on her tongue, like they belonged to the earth more than to any living voice. "He who renews the sun within his body restores the breath of the world." The air seemed to change, cooler somehow. The stars shimmered faintly brighter. She closed the notebook, uneasy. In the days that followed, the excavation continued, but Layla found herself more and more drawn to that hidden language. Each night she returned to the chamber alone, lantern light trembling on the walls, the silence pressing closer. She wasn't sure why she kept going back. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps something else. One evening, she discovered a small recess behind the mural, a narrow slot that looked like a shelf. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in linen, sealed with a hardened knot of resin. She lifted it gently, careful not to break it. When she unwrapped it, a faint scent of myrrh filled the air. Inside was a small figure carved from dark wood. It was a pharaoh, unmistakably, yet the face was featureless, smooth, unfinished. In his hands, he held a disk, the same double circle of the sun. Beneath the figure lay another scrap of papyrus. On it was drawn a map, not of Egypt's surface, but of something below it. Lines connected temples, tombs, and rivers, converging at a single point marked with the same symbol. Layla realized with a start that the point lay directly beneath where they stood. She showed the map to Adler the next morning. He studied it for a long time before speaking. If it's genuine, it may refer to an underground network. Some temples were connected by hidden passages for ritual processions, perhaps. But this looks more like a design for a spiritual journey than a physical one. Layla's eyes met his, or both. As they discussed the meaning, a storm began to gather over the valley, a rare event in that dry land. The sky darkened to a bruised gray, and thunder rumbled across the cliffs. The team hurried to cover their equipment, but Layla stayed by the tomb entrance, watching the clouds roll in. The wind lifted her hair and filled the air with the scent of dust and rain. For a moment, lightning flashed, and in that flash, she thought she saw something glimmer on the stone doorway below. A faint outline of the missing name, glowing like gold, then fading again. That night, the storm passed quickly, leaving behind only the hush of wet sand and the cool breath of the Nile. The camp fell silent. Layla dreamed she was standing in a temple of light. The walls shimmered with gold, and before her stood the Pharaoh, tall, calm, his eyes the same as in the mural. He said nothing, only raised his hand toward the sky. Behind him, the sun rose, slow and bright, filling the temple with warmth. She felt its light move through her like a heartbeat, steady and ancient. Then the scene dissolved. She was back in the tomb, the mural before her. But this time, the painted goddess turned her head and whispered, "Remember what was forgotten." Layla woke with a start, her heart thudding softly. The night was quiet again, but somewhere in the distance, she heard that low hum, faint, almost like a memory. She stepped outside her tent, the sand cool beneath her feet. The horizon glowed pale with the first hint of dawn. The world felt heavy with meaning, as though the dream had followed her into waking. She looked toward the tomb, half hidden in shadow, and thought of the phrase carved along its walls. He who unites the sun with the flesh brings life eternal. A chill moved through her. The dream had felt real. Too real. Perhaps, she thought, the Pharaoh had never died at all. The night in Thebes was still, the Nile whispering softly under a pale moon. Torches flickered along the riverbanks, their flames bending with the wind like ancient prayers. A lone figure moved through the cool sand near the temple walls, a young scribe named Hori, carrying a bundle of papyrus scrolls under his arm. He was small and quiet, the kind of man the priests barely noticed. Yet his hands trembled that night, because he carried something he was never meant to see. Inside those scrolls were stories, rituals once performed by the Pharaoh himself. They were not battles or royal decrees, but records of sacred unions, ceremonies where human flesh and divine belief intertwined. He stopped near the shadow of a colossal statue of Osiris, its gaze carved in eternal calm. Hori looked up at the god's stone face and whispered, "Forgive me." The scrolls were not his to read, but curiosity had always been stronger than fear. Inside the temple, he had overheard priests speak of the rite of the horizon, a ritual said to grant divine rebirth to the pharaoh through symbolic union with the goddess. What that meant, no one dared to explain aloud. The priest said it was not physical. It was spiritual, a joining of God and man through symbols of fertility and renewal. Yet the way they spoke, the way they guarded the chamber, told him there was more to it. Days earlier, the high priest had ordered every record sealed. "These words are for the afterlife," he said, his tone echoing through the sandstone hall. But Hori had seen enough hieroglyphs to sense something deeper, something hidden between the lines. Some carvings showed the pharaoh standing beside the goddess Hathor, goddess of love and beauty, while others showed him before Isis, the divine mother. Both women were symbols of creation, and yet their depictions were startlingly human, tender, almost intimate. The more Hori read, the more he began to feel that these rituals were not simply religious, they were personal. Pharaohs were seen as gods on earth, living bridges between heaven and humankind. Every act they performed carried meaning, every union a reflection of cosmic order. What looked strange to modern eyes was to them a sacred duty. Fertility was power, and power was divine. The seed of the pharaoh represented the rebirth of Egypt itself, the endless flooding of the Nile, the rhythm of life that turned desert into paradise. But something about the oldest text disturbed him. One papyrus spoke of a ceremony where the pharaoh was expected to reenact the myth of Osiris and Isis, the story of death and resurrection. It described how Isis gathered the broken pieces of Osiris to bring him back to life, symbolizing renewal and love beyond death. In the ritual, the pharaoh and the high priestess would take the roles of those gods. It was said to ensure the fertility of the land and the continued favor of the gods. To the people watching, it was symbolic, but the way the words were written in delicate, deliberate phrases suggested a more physical interpretation, something only those present inside the temple walls would ever understand. As the scribe read, he noticed references to things that would be considered unthinkable in later centuries. Certain animals, sacred to the gods, were part of these rites, not as participants, but as symbols of strength and life. Bulls represented virility. Cats symbolized protection and desire. Crocodiles embodied death and rebirth. What outsiders might see as disturbing or strange, the Egyptians saw as layers of spiritual meaning. Nothing was done for pleasure. It was all for balance, for cosmic order, for Ma'at, the sacred harmony that governed every part of their lives. Still, the more Hori read, the more his thoughts drifted to questions no one dared to ask aloud. How much of this was true? Did the pharaoh truly believe he was divine? Or was he trapped by his own legend, forced to perform acts that blurred the line between human need and godly command? He imagined the young pharaoh, barely older than himself, standing in the golden chamber, surrounded by chanting priests and flickering oil lamps, preparing to take part in a ritual that had been performed for centuries. How must it have felt to be worshipped as a god, yet burdened with the expectations of heaven and earth? The temple itself held secrets even older than the scrolls. Beneath its foundation, there were chambers the priests never entered, chambers said to contain relics from the time of the first kings. The walls were covered in painted scenes, men and women offering lotus flowers, sacred oils, and mirrors to unseen gods. In one chamber, a carving showed a pharaoh seated on a throne, with the goddess Isis kneeling before him, her hand raised toward his chest. Scholars today might argue over what it meant, but to the ancient priests, it symbolized the transfer of divine essence, the moment when a mortal became a god. Night after night, Hori returned to that chamber. He began to feel that the air itself was alive there, heavy with whispers of the past. Sometimes, when a moonlight struck the carvings, they seemed to move as if the figures were breathing again. He could almost hear the music that must have once filled these halls, the slow rhythm of drums, the deep chants of priests invoking life into stone. It wasn't frightening. It was mesmerizing, like falling into a dream that smelled of incense and river mist. But one night, as he was preparing to leave, he heard something behind him. The sound was faint, a brush of cloth against stone. He froze. The torches flickered. In the reflection of the bronze offering bowl, he saw a shadow moving behind him. Slowly, he turned. A figure stood in the doorway, draped in linen, face hidden behind a golden mask. It was the high priest. His voice, when it came, was calm but heavy. "You have read what was forbidden," he said. "Now you carry the burden of knowledge not meant for the living." Hori fell to his knees. "I didn't mean to disobey," he whispered. "I only wanted to understand." The priest stepped closer. "And you will," he said softly. "But understanding comes with a price." These rites were never about desire. They were about creation, the endless cycle that binds gods and men. What you've seen written in these scrolls is not what it appears to be. He lifted one of the scrolls from Hori's hands, and held it to the torchlight. The firelight danced over the ink, revealing faint drawings between the lines, symbols invisible in the daylight. "These are the hidden verses," the priest said. "Only those initiated into the temple know how to read them. You think you've uncovered truth, but you've only touched its shadow." Hori stared at the flames, his breath shallow. "Then what is the truth?" The priest's eyes glinted behind the mask. "That even gods are bound by their own myths," he said. "And sometimes the most sacred acts are the ones least understood." The torches dimmed as the priest turned to leave. Hori was left kneeling in the dark, his mind burning with questions. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the distant sound of temple bells. Somewhere deep in the earth, beneath the tombs and sand, the secrets of the pharaohs waited, sealed by time itself. He knew then that his journey into forbidden knowledge had only begun. The next morning, when the first light touched the Nile, Hori found that the scrolls had vanished. The chamber where he had hidden them was empty, and the floor was freshly swept. Yet, when he looked closely, he noticed faint marks in the dust, footprints leading toward a sealed stairway beneath the temple. Whatever secrets he had found, someone had taken them deeper, far beyond reach. Still, a part of him couldn't let go. He could feel it now, the pull of something vast and ancient calling him back into the shadows. The mysteries of the pharaohs weren't just written on papyrus. They were carved into the soul of Egypt itself. And somewhere beneath the golden sands, the truth still waited to be uncovered. The air inside the sealed stairway was cold and dry, as if the centuries themselves had stopped breathing. Hori pressed his hand to the stone door, feeling the faint groove of hieroglyphs beneath his fingertips. The carvings told no story, just a warning. Only the pure of purpose may pass into the house of the living gods. He hesitated. The light of his oil lamp flickered against the sandstone, throwing trembling shadows across the walls. Somewhere beyond that door lay the truth that had haunted him for nights. The hidden rites, the missing scrolls, the power that made men believe they could touch divinity. He pushed. The door gave way with a deep groan, the sound echoing through unseen chambers below. Dust fell like powder from a ceiling. A narrow staircase spiraled downward, carved directly into the stone. Hori raised his lamp and descended, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air thickened, carrying the smell of incense long extinguished and something else, something metallic, like the faint memory of blood. As he reached the bottom, the tunnel widened into a vast chamber. The ceiling was high, supported by carved columns shaped like lotus stems. In the center stood a stone altar, surrounded by murals that shimmered faintly in the lamplight. On those walls, painted in faded reds and golds, were scenes that made Hori's breath catch. He saw the pharaoh standing before a figure draped in white, the high priestess, embodiment of Isis. Around them, priests held vessels of oil and water, their faces hidden by animal masks. Bulls, falcons, jackals, all sacred, all watching. The painting was beautiful and eerie at once, like a memory frozen in ritual. Hori moved closer, noticing a strange pattern along the border of the mural. Between the hieroglyphs, tiny symbols were scratched into the paint, hidden messages. They weren't part of the original scene. They were added later by a hand that wanted to preserve what others had tried to erase. He traced one with his finger and realized they weren't random. They formed words. The pharaoh became a god, not by blood, but by illusion. The message chilled him. Illusion? Could it be that these sacred acts, these divine rituals, were not what they seemed? Had generations of priests hidden a human truth behind a veil of holiness? He felt a sudden weight in his chest. All his life, he had been told that the pharaoh was divine by birth, the son of Ra, the living God on earth. But what if it was only a story that made people obey? From the darkness at the edge of the chamber, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Hori spun around, raising his lamp. The light fell upon an old woman kneeling near a pillar. Her skin was pale from the lack of sun, her hair thin and silver, but her eyes glowed with strange calm. She wore the simple linen of a temple servant. "I thought this place was sealed," Hori said softly. "It was," she replied, her voice rough with age. "Until you opened it. You carry the same hunger they did, the hunger for knowing what lies beyond the veil." She rose slowly and stepped into the light. "I am Nefret," she said. "I once served the high priestess of the house of Isis. When the last pharaoh died, the temple fell silent, and the priests sealed this place. But I stayed. Someone had to remember." Hori's heart quickened. "Then you know what these rituals meant." Nefret smiled faintly, her eyes drifting toward the mural. "What they meant and what they became. The pharaoh's body was the bridge between heaven and earth. Every ritual, every symbol was meant to maintain that balance. But over time, belief became obsession. They began to act out the myths instead of understanding them. The union with the goddess was never meant to be literal. It was a reflection of creation itself. The seed of the pharaoh represented the Nile, the womb of the goddess, the fertile earth. When the two met, Egypt lived again. She paused, touching the wall gently. But some rulers wanted more. They wanted to become gods, not just represent them. And so they began to mimic the myths too closely. The rites became more secret, more extreme. What was once symbolic turned physical. The priests claimed it was sacred, but many began to question if it was blasphemy. Hori swallowed hard, his throat dry. "So, the scrolls I read, they were the records of those who questioned?" Nefret nodded, and they were silenced. When a scribe writes the truth often dies with him. Her eyes glinted in the torchlight. The last pharaoh to perform the rite of the horizon believed that through divine union he could achieve eternal life. But when he died, his body was found covered in gold dust, his tomb sealed in haste. They said he ascended, but others whispered that the gods punished his arrogance. Hori felt a shiver. The old woman's words painted a picture of a kingdom torn between faith and fear. He thought of the high priest's warning, the burden of knowledge not meant for the living. Maybe this was it. Maybe the truth wasn't divine at all. It was human, flawed, desperate. Nefret led him toward the far wall, where a small stone door lay half-buried under sand. "Behind this lies the chamber of the first pharaoh who defied the gods," she whispered. "His name has been erased from every tablet, but his story still lives here." Hori hesitated. What happened to him? She looked at him sadly. He tried to create life by his own hand, to summon the goddess through mortal means. But the gods remained silent. The priests called it heresy. When he died, they sealed his name in darkness, so that his soul would never find peace. Hori touched the door, feeling the ancient chill of the stone. "Then why show me this?" "Because you've already seen too much to turn back," Nefret said quietly. "You must understand what belief can become when men mistake themselves for gods. Every empire that rose from this land carried the same curse, the desire to control creation." For a moment, the silence in the chamber deepened, heavy as the sand above their heads. Hori could hear his heartbeat echoing against the walls. He looked back at the mural, at the painted faces of gods and mortals blending into one another, and he suddenly felt small, like a grain of dust in the current of eternity. Then, without warning, a sound echoed from the stairway above. Heavy footsteps, voices speaking in low tones. The priests. Nefret's expression turned to fear. "They followed you," she whispered. "Go, hide in the lower passage." "But what about you?" She smiled faintly, placing a trembling hand on his arm. "I've been waiting too long to fear them now. Go before they see you." Hori hesitated, then slipped behind a pillar and ducked into the narrow tunnel she pointed to. Through a crack in the wall, he saw torchlight spill into the chamber. The high priest entered first, followed by two others. Their faces were grim, their steps slow and deliberate. "The boy has opened the gate," one of them said. "He must not leave this place alive." The high priest raised his hand for silence. "No, let him wander. The deeper he goes, the more truth will consume him. Let the gods deal with him." They turned and began chanting softly, their voices merging with the low hum of the air. The flames of their torches flickered against the mural, and for a moment, Hori thought he saw the painted eyes of the pharaoh glow. In the darkness of the tunnel, he pressed his back to the wall, holding his breath. Somewhere beyond this passage, deeper within the earth, lay the chamber Nefert had shown him, the tomb of the forgotten pharaoh. And perhaps, within it, the answer to the question that had haunted Egypt for centuries. Did the pharaohs truly ascend to gods, or did they bury their sins beneath gold and silence? Hori's lamp dimmed, its last light flickering like a dying star. He took a deep breath and stepped forward into the darkness, unaware that what he was about to find would change how history itself remembered the gods of Egypt. The tunnel grew narrower as Hori moved forward, the rough walls scraping his shoulders. His oil lamp cast a weak, trembling glow, barely enough to cut through the darkness. The air was heavy now, thick with dust and the faint scent of something ancient, frankincense, maybe, or the long-faded perfume of embalming oils. The silence was so complete that even his own breath sounded strange to him, like a whisper that didn't belong to this world. He had lost count of how many steps he'd taken when the passage finally opened into a small circular chamber. The ceiling was low, the stone blackened by smoke, and in the center stood a sarcophagus carved from dark granite. Unlike the ornate tombs above, this one was plain, unadorned, almost deliberately so. A single line of hieroglyphs ran along the edge, faint from time. Hori brushed the dust away and traced the symbols with his fingers. They read, "The one who dared to live as a god shall sleep forever among the forgotten." He knelt beside the sarcophagus, heart pounding. This had to be the lost pharaoh, the ruler Nefert spoke of, whose name was erased from history. Yet, despite the warning, he felt drawn to open it. It wasn't curiosity now, it was something else. A quiet, irresistible pull, as if the stone itself called out to him. With effort, he slid the lid aside, the grinding echo filling the chamber. Inside lay a figure wrapped in faded linen, perfectly preserved despite the passing of centuries. The body was small, almost fragile. Its face was covered with a gold mask, but not like the ones Hori had seen in the tombs of kings. This one was rough, hastily made, its features human but unfinished. And then he noticed something stranger, a papyrus scroll clutched tightly between the mummy's hands. The edges were blackened, as if it had once been burned. Carefully, Hori pried it loose. The parchment crackled, but didn't break. He unrolled it slowly, holding it near the lamplight. The writing was uneven, rushed, and yet unmistakably royal. It was a confession. The words began with a plea to the gods. The pharaoh wrote of a vision sent by Ra himself, commanding him to unite with the goddess to bring new life to Egypt. But the goddess never came. The priests insisted he continue the ritual, claiming his divine power alone could summon her. So he did. He performed the rite of the horizon as they directed, alone, before the altar of Isis, surrounded by masks and chants. He offered his own body as the vessel of rebirth. But the gods remained silent. The crops failed, the Nile receded, and the people began to whisper. In desperation, the pharaoh ordered a final ceremony, an act meant to awaken divine favor. The text became fragmented, smudged with age, but one phrase stood out clearly. The gods did not answer. So I became the god myself. Hori's breath caught. It wasn't arrogance, it was madness. The pharaoh had believed he could transform himself through ritual, crossing the line between faith and delusion. The priests, terrified of what they had unleashed, erased his name and buried him in secrecy, hoping to seal the curse forever. As Hori read the final line, the flame of his lamp flickered violently. A sudden gust of air swept through the chamber, though there was no visible opening. The walls seemed to hum, the carvings faintly vibrating. For a moment, he thought he heard a voice, soft, distant, echoing from the sarcophagus. A whisper in ancient Egyptian, so faint he barely caught the words, "I am not gone." He stumbled back, the lamp shaking in his hand. The sound faded as quickly as it came, leaving only silence. He tried to steady his breath, convincing himself it was the wind. But something about the air felt alive now, charged with the weight of unseen eyes. He rolled up the scroll and tucked it inside his cloak. Whatever truth it held, it had to be preserved. But how could he bring it to light without the priests finding out? They would destroy it, and him along with it. Then, faintly, from the tunnel behind him, he heard footsteps. Slow, careful, not the echo of one, but many. The priest had followed. Hori's first instinct was to hide, but there was nowhere left to go. The chamber had no exit but the way he came. He could already see the flicker of torchlight reflecting off the walls. Desperate, he turned back to the sarcophagus. There was space behind it, narrow but deep enough to crawl into. He slipped behind the stone, pressing himself into the shadows as the footsteps drew closer. Voices filled the room. The chamber of the lost one priest murmured. It's been centuries since anyone entered. The high priest's voice followed, calm and cold. The boy is near. I can feel it. He carries what should never have been read. They spread out, their torches lighting the dark corners. The glow passed dangerously close to where Hori hid. He held his breath, clutching the scroll to his chest. One of the priests leaned over the sarcophagus, examining the mummy inside. Still intact, he said, and the seal untouched. Good, the high priest replied. Then the curse remains. He reached into his robes and drew out a small jar, sealed with wax. Prepare the offering, he ordered. We must restore the silence of this place. Two priests began chanting, their low voices resonating through the chamber. Hori watched through the gap in the stone as they poured oil around the sarcophagus, then lit it with their torches. The flames spread in a ring, thin but bright, casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. The high priest lifted his head and spoke a final incantation. By the will of the gods, let the truth of the living be sealed among the dead. The fire hissed, and the chamber filled with smoke. The priests turned to leave, their torches vanishing one by one into the tunnel. When their voices finally faded, Hori crawled out, coughing. The air was thick, but the fire had already died down. The oil had burned quickly, leaving only a faint line of soot. He stared at the sarcophagus, at the lifeless figure of the forgotten Pharaoh. The mask's empty eyes seemed to follow him. He whispered quietly, "Your truth won't stay buried forever." He turned to leave, clutching the scroll tight. But before he reached the tunnel, something caught his eye, a faint glow on the wall near the base of the mural. He moved closer. The light wasn't from fire. It was from the paint itself, faintly luminescent, revealing a second image beneath the surface. It showed a circle. Within it, the pharaoh kneeling before the goddess. Above them was written, "The union is eternal. Life is born from death." He traced the symbol with his hand and felt the stone shift slightly under his touch. A hidden panel slid open, revealing another passage, descending even deeper into the earth. For a long moment, Hori stood frozen, torn between fear and curiosity. He could leave now, return to the surface, and hide the scroll. But a stronger force pulled him toward that hidden stairway, as though something down there was waiting for him. He took a slow breath, steadying his shaking hands, and whispered to himself, "Just one more truth." Then he stepped through the opening, disappearing into the blackness below, unaware that what lay beneath the lost pharaoh's tomb would not only challenge his faith, but rewrite everything Egypt believed about its gods. The air grew colder as Hori descended the hidden stairway. His lamp burned low, its weak flame fighting against the heavy darkness. The walls here were different, rougher, unfinished, as if they had been carved in secret. He could feel the weight of the earth pressing in, the silence thicker than any he had known. Each step echoed like a heartbeat, steady but uneasy. He had the strange feeling that he was moving not just downward, but backward in time, into a place untouched by light or memory. After what felt like an eternity, the stairs opened into a narrow corridor lined with faded carvings. The images were unlike the graceful art of the upper temples. These figures were distorted, their faces half human, half animal, their bodies twisted in ritual poses. Some appeared to kneel before a glowing orb. Others held vessels raised to the sky. And everywhere, one symbol repeated, a circle within a triangle, the same mark he'd seen glowing on the wall above. Beneath it, a phrase written in ancient script read, "To awaken the god within, the soul must first be undone." Hori's stomach tightened. It was not the kind of inscription found in royal tombs. It felt more like a warning, or perhaps a secret message for those who dared to seek forbidden knowledge. He thought again of Nefret, the old woman who had helped him. She said belief could twist itself into obsession. Perhaps this was where that obsession had led, a place where the line between God and man disappeared entirely. He pressed forward. The tunnel widened, revealing another chamber, smaller than the one above, but filled with objects laid out in careful order. Clay jars, bronze mirrors, and amulets shaped like eyes and serpents. At the center stood a stone table, its surface engraved with concentric circles and strange symbols. It looked almost like a map, but of what he couldn't tell. On one side of the table, half buried in sand, was a wooden box sealed with wax. The seal bore the mark of the royal sun, the emblem of the pharaoh. Hori knelt beside it and pried the wax loose. Inside lay a set of scrolls bound with leather, their ends blackened as though they had narrowly escaped fire. He unrolled the first one and froze. The handwriting was different from the pharaoh's confession. It was the voice of someone else, a priest perhaps, or a witness to what had happened here. The opening line read, "On the 7th night of the eclipse, the pharaoh commanded the final rite. We, the chosen, were sworn to silence. But what we saw cannot be forgotten." The scroll described a ceremony held in the deepest chambers of the temple, far from the eyes of the people. The pharaoh, believing himself abandoned by the gods, ordered the priest to summon the divine through his own reflection. The rite involved mirrors placed around a pool of sacred oil, meant to capture the light of Ra. As the chants rose, the reflections multiplied, showing the pharaoh not as one man, but as many, each version of himself shifting, distorted, as though the gods were trying to speak through his image. But the ritual went wrong. The light vanished. The mirrors cracked. The oil caught fire. And when it was over, the pharaoh's eyes were said to glow with gold. From that night on, he refused to speak to anyone. He called himself not by his birth name, but by a title, the living son. Hori's pulse quickened as he read on. The priest had tried to undo what they had created, but it was too late. The pharaoh began performing secret rites in solitude, claiming he no longer needed the gods to grant him life. Those who questioned him vanished. Those who obeyed built chambers like this one, places of silence and secrecy. The priests eventually turned against him, sealing the lower sanctuaries and erasing his name from the walls. As Hori's eyes scanned the final lines, he noticed a small symbol at the edge of the scroll, the same triangle and circle, but drawn in red ink. Beneath it, the words, "He waits in the mirror of the living." He sat back, staring at the stone table. The words pulsed in his mind. Could it be that the ancient pharaoh believed he had trapped his own soul in reflection? Was that why the priests sealed these chambers, to keep that reflection from ever being seen again? Before he could think further, a faint sound reached his ears, a shuffle, a whisper of movement from the tunnel behind him. He turned sharply, holding the lamp high. Nothing. The silence returned. Yet he could feel it again, that prickling sense of being watched. He told himself it was only the darkness playing tricks, but part of him knew better. He gathered the scrolls into his cloak and stood, looking around the room one last time. Then, as he turned toward the passage, his lamp's flame wavered. For an instant, it illuminated something across the wall, a polished bronze plate, tarnished but reflective. He moved closer. The plate had been set into the stone deliberately, like a mirror. His reflection looked strange in it, blurred and shifting in the flickering light. But then, just as he leaned closer, something inside the metal seemed to move, a flash of gold, a shadow behind his own face. He stumbled back, dropping the lamp. It hit the floor and sputtered out, plunging him into darkness. For a long moment there was nothing, only the sound of his heartbeat and the faint drip of water echoing somewhere deep in the stone. He knelt, fumbling to relight the lamp. When it finally flared back to life, the mirror was dull again, his own reflection still and ordinary. Yet the feeling remained that he was not alone in this chamber. He turned to leave, his footsteps echoing softly. As he neared the stairway, he heard a voice, faint as wind, whisper his name. It came from behind him, from the direction of the mirror. He froze. The voice came again, clearer now, though still distant. "You open the door. Now you must see." Hori's throat tightened. "Who's there?" The silence that followed was complete, but somehow heavier than before. Then, slowly, the bronze plate began to glow faintly, the same golden shimmer he had seen before. His reflection changed again, his eyes turning gold, his mouth twisting into a smile that wasn't his own. He stumbled backward, tripping against the stone steps. The lamp fell once more, the flame dying instantly. The chamber sank into darkness again. But this time, he didn't try to relight it. He only sat there, frozen, listening to the soft hum rising from the walls. It was the same low chant he'd heard the priest recite, ancient words meant to bind what could not die. Up above, the temple bells began to toll. It was dawn. Somewhere beyond the tomb, the priest would soon return, sealing the passage forever. Hori clutched the scrolls tightly, his heart pounding. He had come seeking truth, but now the truth was staring back at him from the shadows. He took a deep breath, stood, and began to climb the stairs. Each step upward felt heavier, as though something below was trying to pull him back. When he reached the top, he pushed open the hidden panel and stepped into the faint morning light. The temple courtyard was empty, silent except for the whisper of wind against the sandstone columns. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe. But as he turned toward the Nile, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a pool of water by the steps. His eyes, for just a heartbeat, gleamed with the same faint gold as the Pharaoh's mask. Then it vanished, leaving only the tired face of a young scribe who had gone too far. The secret was no longer buried, and somewhere beneath the sands, the reflection waited, patient and eternal, for the next soul curious enough to seek it. The air in Luxor grew heavy as the evening fell, and the museum emptied until only the soft hum of the air conditioner remained. Dr. Nyla sat alone in her office, the light from her desk lamp stretching across scattered notes. She traced the drawings from the tomb, the scenes of ritual and union, the strange mix of tenderness and power. Her mind turned over the question she couldn't shake. Why did the pharaohs tie their rule so closely to acts of intimacy and fertility? It was more than ritual. It was identity, belief, survival. Each act told a story of creation and divine balance. Yet the deeper she looked, the more she sensed that something sacred had been lost in translation. In her notes, a pattern began to form. The carvings always showed the pharaoh with a goddess, never a mortal woman. Sometimes the goddess was Hathor, the mother of joy and fertility. Sometimes it was Isis, the devoted wife and protector. And sometimes it was an unnamed figure, carved without inscription, shrouded in mystery. These scenes appeared not only in temples, but even on funerary objects, suggesting that this connection between sexuality and power continued beyond death. The pharaoh's body, in life and after, was thought to house divine energy. Preserving that energy meant preserving the kingdom's balance. As Nyla read the ancient hymns, she noticed repeated phrases that seemed to blur human and divine roles. The pharaoh was described as both the son and the lover of the goddess. To modernize this language seemed confusing, even disturbing. But in Egyptian belief, such unions weren't literal. They were symbolic expressions of renewal. When the pharaoh united with a goddess, it represented harmony between the earth and the heavens, the masculine and feminine forces that sustained life along the Nile. Still, something about the repetition of the imagery, the deliberate secrecy, made her wonder if there were hidden practices known only to priests and the royal family. That night, she returned to her hotel overlooking the Nile. The sound of water lapping against the stone walls below lulled her into a light sleep. In her dreams, she was walking through a corridor of golden walls, lit by flickering lamps. Figures moved in the shadows, priests chanting, women adorned with lotus petals, a pharaoh standing before an altar. A deep, rhythmic hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls like a pulse. Then she saw it, a ritual pool reflecting torchlight, and beside it, a scroll sealed with wax, bearing the royal insignia of Amenhotep III. Before she could reach for it, a whisper broke through the dream. The seed of gods must be guarded, not shared. She woke with her heart racing, her hands trembling. The next morning, she visited an old friend, Professor Ahmed, who had spent his career studying temple inscriptions. His small office smelled of dust and papyrus, and the shelves bowed under the weight of ancient texts. When Nyla described her dream, Ahmed frowned, not out of disbelief, but recognition. He pulled a small, cracked tablet from his drawer. "You may not be far from something real," he said quietly. "There are old stories, records that speak of ceremonies where the pharaoh was expected to prove his divine essence before the priests. It wasn't about pleasure or sin. It was about demonstrating that life itself flowed through him." Nyla listened, captivated. Ahmed went on. In some accounts, the pharaoh would enter a sacred chamber at dawn, symbolically uniting with the goddess in ritual form. Sometimes, a high priestess stood in as her earthly vessel. The ritual wasn't for the public eye. Only a handful of priests witnessed it. They said that through this act, the pharaoh renewed the world's fertility, the flood of the Nile, the harvest, even the rise of the sun. Everything was tied to this sacred balance. He paused, adjusting his glasses. But some rituals, he continued, were not symbolic. Certain pharaohs, particularly during the late 18th dynasty, began to take these myths literally. They believed that divine union could be enacted physically, that it would make them closer to the gods. This is where the line between faith and flesh blurred. Nyla's breath caught. "And what happened to those pharaohs?" she asked. Ahmed smiled faintly. "They became legends and warnings. Some say their reigns ended in madness. Others believe their names were erased, not because of failure, but because of what they dared to reveal." As she left Ahmed's office, Nyla couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking a dangerous line herself. Every discovery pulled her deeper into a world where sacred duty and human desire overlapped, where symbols might hide truths too uncomfortable for modern understanding. She thought of the sealed tomb beneath the sands, rumored to contain artifacts of rituals never documented. The permit to excavate it had been pending for months, but if her findings held weight, it might finally be granted. That night, she sat by her hotel window again, watching the moonlight stretch over the Nile. It was easy to see why the ancients saw divinity in this land. The river shimmered like liquid silver, flowing endlessly, just as the Egyptians believed life flowed from creation to death and back again. Somewhere in the desert, beyond the reach of tourists and lights, lay the resting places of kings who had touched the boundary between mortal and divine. In the stillness, she whispered to herself, what if the truth was never meant to be found? Yet the curiosity that had guided her all her life wouldn't let go. Every grain of sand seemed to hide a story, every scarab a secret. Egypt was not done speaking. It simply chose its listeners carefully. The next morning, her research permit arrived. The timing felt too perfect, almost guided. The excavation site was set near an old temple of Hathor, known for its associations with love and fertility. The local guides were uneasy about working there. Some said the ground was cursed, that strange lights appeared at night, and whispers echoed from the ruins. Nyla brushed it off as folklore, but part of her wondered whether ancient energy still lingered. When her team began digging, they unearthed fragments of painted reliefs showing the pharaoh standing before the goddess, their hands touching, a lotus flower blooming between them. The imagery was delicate, reverent, yet beneath it was something unsettling, as if the figures were alive, caught in an endless ritual. Then, on the third day, one of the workers called her over. He He had found a small box sealed with hardened resin. Inside was a rolled papyrus, remarkably preserved. She unrolled it carefully, her heart pounding. The writing was faded, but legible enough to recognize royal script. The text spoke of the night of renewal and the union of breath and seed. It described a ceremony performed in the House of Gold, deep within the temple, where the pharaoh would offer his vitality to ensure Egypt's prosperity. But the last line was incomplete, as if the scribe had stopped mid-word. Only a faint symbol followed, a single eye drawn in red ink. That symbol appeared again later that night in her dreams. This time the eye blinked. The whisper returned, "The living God watches. Do not disturb his rest." When Nyla woke, she wasn't sure what frightened her more, the dream itself, or the sense that it wasn't entirely her own imagination. She poured herself some water, staring at the darkness outside, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of the Nile. Somewhere in those ripples lay the truth she was chasing, a truth the pharaohs had buried under the weight of divinity and desire. And as the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, painting the desert gold, she felt it again, the pull of history, mysterious and irresistible, urging her deeper into the secrets Egypt had guarded for millennia. The story was only beginning, and the past was far from silent. The next few days unfolded in a haze of dust, sunlight, and quiet anticipation. The excavation site buzzed with soft chatter in the early hours, but as the sun climbed high, silence fell over the workers. They knew they were standing on sacred ground, land that once echoed with chants, drums, and the hum of ancient rituals. Even the wind seemed to move differently here, curling through the ruins like a whisper from another time. Dr. Nyla walked the site slowly each morning, her notebook in hand, watching every discovery with reverence and restraint. The papyrus from the sealed box remained locked in her tent at night, its mystery lingering like incense. Her assistant, Kareem, a young archaeologist with a fascination for mythology, joined her by the trench on the fifth morning. "I've been studying the relief fragments," he said, brushing sand from a slab of limestone. "This symbol here, it's not just the Eye of Ra. Look closely. The pupil is shaped like a lotus. That's unusual. It could mean this was tied to Hathor or fertility rites." Nyla nodded, crouching beside him. The lotus had always represented rebirth in Egyptian belief, rising pure from the mud, untouched despite its origins. It was beauty born from decay. The thought stirred something inside her. "So the eye doesn't just watch," she murmured. "It renews. It witnesses creation itself." Kareem hesitated before replying. "There's more. The inscriptions nearby mention something called the breath of the Nile. I can't find it in any existing record. Whatever this ritual was, it might have been unique to this temple." That name stayed with her throughout the day, the breath of the Nile. It sounded both sacred and human, like something that belonged to the pulse of life itself. She wondered if it referred to a chant, an offering, or perhaps something more abstract, an act meant to awaken divine energy. The more she thought about it, the more it felt like the ritual described in the papyrus, the one left unfinished by its scribe. That evening, as the heat began to fade, she sat with the local foreman, a man named Youssef, who had spent decades assisting foreign archaeologists. His eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from generations living beside the ruins. Over tea, she asked him if he'd ever heard the phrase "the breath of the Nile." He stirred his drink slowly before answering. "My grandmother used to speak of it," he said in a low voice. "She said it was something the pharaohs did when the floods came late, when the people feared the river had lost its soul. They believed the ruler could breathe life back into the Nile through a sacred act in the temple. No one knew what it truly meant. Only the priests and the chosen could enter those chambers." He paused, eyes fixed on the horizon where the last of the sunlight bled into the sand. "But she also said those who tried to uncover such things later often lost their way." That night, Nyla dreamed again. The same golden corridors appeared, but this time the air was thicker, perfumed with incense and heavy with unseen presences. She found herself standing before a statue of Hathor, her face serene, her cow horns cradling the solar disk. In front of the statue was a pool of still water. When Nyla leaned closer, she saw her reflection ripple, then change. It wasn't her face anymore, but that of a pharaoh, eyes lined with kohl, gaze steady and distant. The reflection smiled faintly and whispered, "Breathe, and the gods shall awaken." When she woke, the air inside her tent felt strangely alive, as if it carried a pulse of its own. The papyrus she had locked away lay open on her desk, even though no one had touched it. The last line still ended abruptly with that red eye. But something new glimmered faintly in the corner, a mark she hadn't noticed before. A single hieroglyph, a reed leaf, symbolizing breath or air. She stared at it, chills creeping up her arms. Was it always there, or had the ink deepened somehow overnight? She didn't believe in omens, yet the coincidence gnawed at her. Over the next week, the excavation uncovered a narrow passage leading deeper underground. The air grew cooler as they descended, the walls decorated with faded murals of blue and gold. Unlike the public temple above, these chambers carried a different tone, more secretive, more intimate. The figures carved here weren't shown before crowds, but in closed spaces, surrounded by symbols of fertility, harvest, and rebirth. The deeper they went, the more the imagery shifted, from serene depictions of gods to scenes that felt more human, almost vulnerable. The pharaohs were shown not as conquerors, but as seekers, standing before divine figures with open hands, their crowns set aside. One mural in particular caught Nyla's eye. It showed the pharaoh and Hathor face to face, a stream of blue lines connecting their mouths, air flowing between them. Beneath the scene were hieroglyphs translating roughly to life given through the breath of devotion. Kareem stood beside her, whispering, "It's like they believed divine union was a literal exchange of life force." Nyla nodded slowly, and maybe that was the breath of the Nile. Not a physical act, but a merging of spirit, the pharaoh offering his own vitality to sustain Egypt. But another question lingered. Why was it hidden? Why were these rituals buried beneath layers of secrecy? As if in response, a soft tremor ran through the ground. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the workers murmured nervously. It was brief, almost like the earth had sighed. Yusef crossed himself instinctively and muttered a prayer. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the old gods remember when we speak their names too often." Later that evening, Nyla sat by the excavation lamps, staring into the open passage. The desert around them was still, but something about the silence felt heavy, as if waiting. She thought about the pharaohs who had walked these paths thousands of years ago, men who ruled empires yet still sought divine approval, still feared death and loss. For all their power, they had turned to the same mysteries humans always did: love, creation, renewal. The more she pieced together, the more the story blurred between myth and truth. Perhaps these bizarre sexual rites weren't meant to shock or entertain. Perhaps they were humanity's earliest attempts to explain the intimacy between life and the divine. Every offering, every ritual breath was an act of longing, for meaning, for connection, for eternity. But as her thoughts deepened, so did the sense of unease. A pattern had emerged in her dreams and discoveries: the breath, the eye, the warning not to disturb what was sacred. It was as if something unseen was aware of her search. On the 10th day, just before dawn, Kareem woke her urgently. "You need to see this," he whispered. He led her to the main trench, where a portion of the underground chamber had collapsed slightly, revealing a new doorway. The stone frame was engraved with rows of symbols: eyes, lotuses, and spirals that seemed to twist inward endlessly. At the center of the doorway was an inscription written in red, the same hue as the ink from the papyrus. It read, "Here rests the breath of the Nile. Let none disturb what binds heaven to earth." Nyla stood frozen, the cool air brushing her face. Behind that doorway, she felt the pulse of something ancient, something alive. The workers waited for her signal, their lamps flickering in the darkness. She hesitated, caught between wonder and fear. This could change everything. Kareem whispered. Yes, she replied softly. Or it could end everything we understand about them. Her fingers hovered over the stone, tracing the carved lotus. The air grew colder, almost metallic, and for a brief moment, she thought she heard a faint inhale, like the sound of the desert itself breathing. Then the wind rose suddenly, sweeping through the ruins, snuffing out the lamps one by one. And in that pitch-dark silence, Nyla felt it again. The whisper from her dreams, closer now, more real than ever. The gods remember, it said, and they are not yet done speaking. The next morning would bring sunlight, cameras, and officials eager for discoveries. But in that quiet, endless night, Nyla knew something profound had awakened. Something buried beneath time and myth, waiting to reveal the secret the Pharaohs had guarded for millennia. And as the wind carried the faint scent of lotus through the tent, the Nile, calm and eternal, flowed as though it too was holding its breath. The morning after the sandstorm, the excavation site felt different. The air was still, almost unnaturally so, and the desert seemed to hold its breath. Nyla walked slowly across the trench, the sand crunching softly beneath her boots. The new doorway they had uncovered stood there like a silent guardian, half buried and half revealed, glowing faintly gold under the rising sun. Kareem was already there, kneeling beside it with a flashlight, studying the carvings that shimmered faintly when the light hit them. He turned as she approached, his face pale, but his eyes alive with restless excitement. I checked the markings again, he said quietly. They matched the ones from the papyrus. The same hand, the same style. This chamber, it's connected to the breath of the Nile ritual. I'm sure of it now. Nyla nodded, though her chest felt tight. Then what we're standing in front of might be the most secret room ever built in this temple. Kareem ran his hand gently along the edge of the doorway, brushing away loose dust. Do we open it today? He asked. She hesitated, staring at the symbols. The red ink had darkened overnight, as if the stone itself had absorbed the color. Not yet, she whispered. We'll document everything first. We moved too fast. We risked destroying what we came to find. But deep inside, she felt that something was already shifting, as if the temple was alive, aware of their presence. The rest of the morning passed in silence. The workers avoided the trench unless instructed, muttering prayers under their breath whenever they glanced at the sealed chamber. Even Youssef, usually calm and steady, seemed uneasy. There's something wrong with this place, he said softly to Nyla as they reviewed sketches. Last night, I heard chanting. I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. Nyla tried to reassure him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. The night before, she had woken to the sound of water dripping, a steady, rhythmic tap like footsteps echoing in a hallway that shouldn't exist. And when she'd stepped outside, the air smelled faintly of lotus and incense, though there was no fire burning anywhere nearby. By noon, Kareem returned from his tent with something he'd found while reviewing their scans. You need to see this, he said, spreading several photos across the table. The carvings near the doorway, there's a pattern that repeats. It's a timeline. Each row shows a different pharaoh performing the same ritual, but in the final panel, the scene changes. The pharaoh isn't standing. He's kneeling, and above him, something descends. Nyla leaned in, her brow furrowed. What do you mean, something? He pointed to a faint, almost erased shape in the carving. It looks like light or spirit, maybe, but this was scratched out deliberately. Someone didn't want it to be seen. Her heart raced. So the last pharaoh who performed the ritual saw something, or believed he did. And then they sealed this chamber, Kareem finished, and never opened it again. That evening, the wind picked up once more, sweeping across the dunes with a low hum that rattled their tents. Nyla sat inside her workspace, reviewing the papyrus again under a dim lamp. The ink seemed to pulse faintly, the hieroglyphs almost alive. She traced the symbols with her finger: breath, renewal, life, sacrifice. The words repeated, cycling endlessly. There was no clear ending, just the same loop, as if the ritual had never truly finished. A soft rustle made her look up. Kareem stood in the entrance, holding a lantern. His expression was tense. "I think we need to open it," he said quietly. "Tonight, before the wind covers it again." She hesitated. Every part of her training told her to wait for proper authorization to document everything. But another part, older, more instinctive, felt drawn to the chamber like gravity. The night outside was deep and endless, the moon veiled behind drifting sand. The entire desert felt like it was waiting. With a slow nod, she said, "Get the lights. No one else comes with us." They moved together down the narrow passage, the sound of their footsteps soft against the sand. The air grew cooler as they descended, heavy with a strange sweetness. When they reached the sealed doorway, the carvings seemed to shimmer under their lantern light, the lotus patterns glowing faintly blue. Nyla placed her palm against the stone, and for a moment she could swear it felt warm, like the pulse of a heartbeat deep within. Kareem set up the lights, then pulled out the small chisel and hammer. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. Carefully. The first tap echoed sharply through the chamber, followed by another and another, until the ancient seal cracked, releasing a faint breath of air that smelled like age and perfume. A chill ran down both their spines. The air that escaped wasn't stale. It was cold, almost fresh, as though the room had been sealed only yesterday. Slowly, the stone gave way, revealing a narrow gap. Nyla held her lantern high and peered through. Inside was a chamber barely larger than a small room, its walls covered with murals of gold and blue. At the center stood a platform draped in linen so fine it still shimmered under the light. On it rested a single object, a stone chest carved with lotus petals and the same red eye from her dreams. As they stepped inside, the sound of the desert disappeared. The air was still and thick, almost liquid in silence. Kareem whispered, "It's like time stopped here." Nyla moved closer to the chest, her light trembling slightly. The carvings told the same story, the pharaoh before the goddess, the breath flowing between them, and at the end, a symbol of rebirth. But beneath it all, there was another layer of faint writing, an inscription too small to notice at first glance. She bent down and read aloud, her voice shaking. "The divine breath restores life to the Nile, but the one who breathes for the gods must give their own." Kareem stared at her, his eyes wide. "A sacrifice?" She didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the chest. Slowly, she reached out, her fingertips grazing the lid. The stone was cool, but it hummed faintly beneath her skin. Something about it felt alive. Then the lantern flickered. Kareem turned sharply, adjusting the flame, but the light dimmed again. The murals seemed to ripple in the half-darkness. For a moment, the painted figures almost appeared to move, the pharaoh exhaling, the goddess inhaling, their golden faces breathing in unison. A low sound filled the chamber. Not a voice, not exactly, but a vibration that trembled through the stone floor. It grew louder, like a pulse, syncing with the beating of her own heart. Kareem whispered, "Do you hear that?" Nyla nodded slowly, unable to speak. The sound seemed to come from the chest itself. She took a deep breath and lifted the lid. Inside was no treasure, no relic, just a small alabaster jar, sealed with wax and wrapped in linen. It glowed faintly, as if lit from within. The hieroglyph carved on its surface matched the last line of the papyrus, the Eye of Ra surrounded by lotus petals. Suddenly, the air grew dense, pressing against their skin. The murals around them brightened, their gold leaf catching an unseen light. Nyla stepped back, clutching the jar to her chest. "It's the breath of the Nile," she whispered, voice trembling. "It's real." Kareem's eyes darted to the walls. "Then what happens if it's opened?" Before she could answer, the lantern went out. In the darkness, the humming grew louder, almost like breathing. Something ancient had awakened, and as the chill spread through the chamber, both of them realized that the pharaohs had not only buried their power here, they had buried their warning too. Outside, the wind howled across the desert, carrying the faint scent of lotus through the night. The Nile, silent and black under the moon, seemed to stir as if remembering. And deep within the temple, in the hollow breath of the gods, Nyla felt history exhale. The past was alive, and it had just taken its first breath. The desert night stretched endlessly over the Valley of Kings. The air was cool now, carrying the faint scent of dust and resin from ancient tombs. In the distance, the torchlight from a hidden chamber flickered against sandstone walls, revealing faded murals that had not seen light in thousands of years. A young scribe named Nefret crouched near the entrance, her heart pounding as she copied the hieroglyphs that covered the walls. She had been told to document every symbol, every carving, but what she was beginning to uncover went far beyond the usual burial rituals. The text spoke of something forbidden, ceremonies of creation and rebirth that the pharaoh himself had performed, acts meant not for human eyes but for the gods alone. Each line she traced seemed to hum with energy, as if the very stone remembered the chants that once echoed through the temple. The king becomes Osiris, one inscription read. The river shall rise when his seed meets the goddess of the Nile. Nefret paused, staring at the words. She whispered softly to herself, "Is this poetry, or is it truth?" Her mentor, an elderly priest named Panihisi, looked up from the shadows and answered quietly, "In Egypt, child, poetry and truth are one and the same." His eyes glowed with an eerie calm as he continued his translation. To rule, one must merge with divinity. The body of the pharaoh was not just mortal flesh. It was the vessel of eternal balance. As the night deepened, the silence of the tomb seemed almost alive. The distant rumble of the Nile reminded them that life and death were always connected here. Panihisi's voice softened as he revealed another passage. When the moon wanes, the pharaoh shall join with the goddess to renew the world. Through the sacred act, the balance between chaos and order will be restored. Nefret shivered. She could not tell if the text described a myth or an actual event. Yet the carvings beside it, a man and woman intertwined beneath a crescent moon, hinted that the ritual had once been more than symbolic. Still, Panihisi warned her, "These are the mysteries of kings. Speak of them to no one. Knowledge can be as dangerous as the desert sun." Outside, the horizon began to shift. Dawn painted the cliffs in muted gold. The excavation team would arrive soon, and with them, questions that neither Nefret nor Panihisi could safely answer. The artifacts recovered from this chamber would likely be sealed again, labeled as ceremonial relics. But both of them knew that the real meaning, the connection between fertility, kingship, and divine power, would remain hidden beneath layers of interpretation. The ancient Egyptians had mastered this art of secrecy. What they showed to the public was only the surface. Beneath that lay an entire spiritual system built on the idea that creation itself began through divine union. Later that day, Nefret stood by the riverbank, watching fishermen cast their nets. The Nile moved with a slow, endless rhythm, like the heartbeat of Egypt itself. She thought of the stories Panihisi had told her, how the pharaoh's role was not simply to rule, but to sustain the cosmic order, known as Ma'at. Without his rituals, the sun would fail to rise, and the river would dry. Even the smallest gesture in these sacred acts carried symbolic meaning. Yet the closer she looked, the more she realized how fragile the boundary was between devotion and desire, between ritual and rule. The pharaoh was expected to embody perfection, but he was still human beneath the golden mask. In the temple city of Thebes, preparations for the festival of Opet were underway. The streets buzzed with life, priests carrying incense, dancers moving in slow rhythm, musicians playing harps and drums. At the heart of it all, the statue of Ammonius, the creator god, was being carried from Karnak to Luxor, symbolizing the renewal of divine power. Pharaoh Seti II, young and ambitious, watched the procession from his balcony. His advisors praised him as a living god, but he could feel the weight of expectation pressing on his chest. Each festival reminded him that his strength was not just political, it was spiritual. The people believed his very breath kept the land fertile. And so, Within the private chambers of the temple, Seti would soon take part in rituals older than the pyramids themselves, rites that bound him to the gods through sacred union. That night, as the procession quieted, Seti found himself alone with the high priestess of Ammonius' temple, a woman named Meritnith. Her role was not of mortal lover, but divine vessel. The ritual was not one of passion, but of renewal, a symbolic merging of heaven and earth. Seti's hands trembled as he recited the ancient words taught to every king. "I'm the son of Ra, the consort of Hathor, the life that fills the two lands." His voice echoed faintly, mingling with the low hum of drums outside. Meritnith, calm and composed, moved with ritual precision, her gestures reflecting cosmic order rather than emotion. To any outsider, this would appear as ceremony, but Seti knew that what they enacted was believed to feed the very cycle of life. Meanwhile, far from the palace, Nefret and Panihisi continued their work in secret. They had uncovered another chamber beneath the tomb, sealed since the time of Akhenaten, the heretic king who had once defied Egypt's gods. Inside, the walls were covered with symbols that differed from any other. They spoke not of creation, but of chaos, of a time when divine order had been broken. In the center stood a small altar, and upon it, a golden vessel filled with hardened resin. Panihisi carefully brushed away the sand and whispered, "This is no ordinary offering. This belonged to the king himself." Nefret leaned closer, her eyes wide. "What is it?" she asked. Panihisi hesitated. "A symbol of rebirth," he said at last. But the way his voice wavered told her there was more, something he dared not reveal. As the days passed, rumors began to spread among the workers. Some claimed they had seen figures moving near the tomb at night, faint lights flickering in the desert, as if spirits guarded the entrance. Others said that the excavation had angered the gods, that the old rites were never meant to be uncovered. Panihisi, though devoted to truth, began to question whether their search had gone too far. "There are things," he murmured one evening, "that were hidden not to be forgotten, but to protect the living." Seti too, found himself haunted. The ritual with Meritnith had stirred something within him, not passion, but fear. He began to dream of ancient kings standing in silence, their eyes burning through darkness. In his dreams, the Nile turned red, and the voice of a god whispered, "The line between heaven and earth must remain closed." He would awaken drenched in sweat, the sound of distant chanting still echoing in his ears. The kingdom thrived outwardly. Crops grew, the river swelled, and the temples overflowed with offerings. Yet an invisible tension lingered. Priests debated whether the rituals were still pure or if they had strayed into forbidden ground. Some whispered that Seti sought to repeat the rites of Osiris himself, merging too closely with divinity. Others claimed the pharaoh had revived ceremonies from Akhenaten's reign, blending faiths that were never meant to coexist. And in the quiet heart of the desert, beneath layers of stone and silence, the tomb that Nefret had opened began to tremble faintly at night, as if remembering the power once sealed within. The air inside grew heavier, and the scent of resin returned, sharper now, almost alive. She couldn't shake the feeling that the past was no longer just being studied. It was awakening. The stage was set for something neither she, nor Panihisi, nor the pharaoh himself could control. Egypt's oldest secret was rising again, and this time it would not stay buried. The heat of the following day pressed down on Thebes like a heavy hand. The scent of incense from the temples drifted through the streets, mingling with the aroma of bread, honey, and dust. Merchants shouted, priests chanted, and the people sang hymns to the gods of fertility and life. But somewhere beneath that vibrant hum of the living world, a quiet unease was growing, the kind that moves like a shadow behind sunlight. The high priest spoke of omens. The river had swelled too early, its waters darker than usual. Birds that once nested on the palace walls had vanished. Even the sacred cats had gone silent at night. It was as if the entire kingdom was holding its breath, waiting for something it could not name. In the grand halls of Karnak Temple, Pharaoh Seti II sat alone before the statue of Ammonius, the hidden god. The chamber was dim, lit only by oil lamps that flickered across the massive stone figure. The gold on Seti's collar shimmered faintly as he bowed his head, whispering prayers meant to reaffirm his place among the divine. Yet his words trembled. The ritual he had performed days ago with Meritnith still lingered in his mind. Though sacred in purpose, it had stirred something more human, a sense of vulnerability. The old text said that during such ceremonies, the boundary between mortal and God thinned. But what if, he wondered, it never closed again? What if the divine did not release him? Meritnith, ever composed and distant, had withdrawn into the temple after the ritual, refusing to speak. Her attendants said she had begun fasting and spent her nights reciting hymns before sealed doors. The priests whispered that she had seen visions during the ceremony, of gods walking in human form, of ancient kings whispering from beyond the veil. One of her servants claimed to have found her trembling by the river at dawn, whispering the same phrase over and over, "He has awakened." No one knew who she meant. Meanwhile, in the valley, Nefret and Panihisi continued their secret study. The inscriptions they uncovered in the newly opened chamber grew stranger with every passing day. They described not only rituals of creation, but warnings, cryptic messages left by priests who feared that their kings had gone too far. One carving depicted a figure wearing the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, surrounded by serpents. Beneath it were words etched in deliberate haste. When man becomes God, the gods will demand the price. Panihisi studied the phrase for a long time before saying, they feared the loss of balance. Even power that serves life can turn to ruin if taken beyond its limit. Nefret nodded, but her curiosity pushed her forward. She had begun to notice connections between the rituals described here and the legends told by farmers and temple workers. Stories of nights when the pharaoh was said to walk the Nile's edge, speaking to the water as if it were alive. Some said he offered his own blood to the river in secret, a symbolic act of union with its spirit. Others claimed he left offerings of flowers and milk, whispering to the goddess within the current. Whatever the truth, Nefret couldn't shake the feeling that these ancient acts were more than symbolism, that they had once been part of a living, breathing system that connected Egypt's rulers to the natural world. One evening, Panihisi invited her to the edge of the desert. The sun was setting, painting the sand in deep shades of amber and red. He pointed toward the horizon, where the line between earth and sky seemed to shimmer. That, he said softly, is where the gods dwell, not above us, not below, but in the space where opposites meet. That's why the rituals existed. Not for pleasure, not for spectacle, but to bridge what could not be touched. He looked at her then, eyes heavy with the burden of years. But some kings, he added, forgot that the bridge was meant to be crossed only in spirit. The next day, strange reports reached Thebes. A team of laborers working near the old tombs had fallen ill. They spoke of visions, golden figures in the dark, whispering in tongues no one understood. When they awoke, they were covered in fine dust, their hands trembling as if they'd touched something sacred or cursed. Panihisi dismissed it as heat exhaustion at first, but when he visited the site himself, he found that the carvings they had uncovered had changed. Symbols that had once been faint were now sharp and fresh, as though newly carved. "Impossible," he muttered, tracing a line with his trembling fingers. "Stone does not rewrite itself." That night, a storm gathered over the desert, rare and sudden. Lightning flashed across the horizon, illuminating the cliffs where the tombs lay hidden. The winds howled through the valley, carrying with them a low, mournful sound that almost resembled chanting. Nefret stood by her small tent, watching as the sand whipped across the camp. Somewhere in the chaos, she thought she heard a voice, faint, ancient, and almost pleading. It spoke her name. She froze, her heart racing. "Panihisi," she called out, but there was no reply. Only the sound of the storm, relentless and alive. When dawn came, the camp was silent. The air smelled of wet stone and dust. Panihisi emerged from his tent, his face pale. He told her he had dreamt of the old kings again. This time, they were not silent. They were standing in a circle around the golden vessel they had unearthed, their mouths moving in rhythm with the wind. "They were warning me," he said. "Something has been unsealed." In the royal palace, Seti too woke from the same dream. He did not know how, but he felt connected to whatever was happening in the desert. He ordered his guards to bring him a report from the valley at once. The priests begged him not to interfere, to let the past remain buried, but Seti's curiosity was stronger than his fear. "If there is truth beneath the sand," he said, "then it belongs to me. I am Egypt." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a growing dread. By the time his envoy reached the excavation site, the storm had erased most of their tracks. The tomb entrance was half buried again, as if the desert itself wanted to hide it. Yet Nephrit and Penihasse refused to leave. They continued to decipher what they could, piecing together a story that seemed to mirror their present moment. It told of a pharaoh who sought to merge fully with the gods, who performed a ritual so powerful that it blurred the line between creation and destruction. The final inscription was unfinished, as if interrupted, and the world trembled, for he had become more than divine. He had become the storm. That night, Nephrit couldn't sleep. She sat outside, listening to the whisper of the wind through the dunes. She felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her, the voices of the past echoing faintly in the night air. Somewhere far away, the sound of drums began, slow, rhythmic, and growing louder. She turned toward the valley and saw torches flickering in the distance. For a moment, she thought it was the excavation team returning, but then she realized the light was too steady, too deliberate. Figures moved among the torches, cloaked and silent, heading toward the sealed tomb. She ran to wake Penihasse, but by the time they reached the entrance, the torches had vanished. Only the faint smell of incense remained, the same scent that filled the temples during royal rituals. Penihasse knelt and touched the sand. "They're repeating the old rites," he whispered. "Someone is trying to bring it back." And as the first light of dawn crept across the valley, the golden vessel inside the tomb began to hum, a low, steady vibration that echoed through the stone. The air shimmered faintly, as if time itself was bending. Nephrit's heart raced as she whispered, "Penihasse, it's awake." The desert held its silence, and somewhere, deep beneath the shifting sands, something older than kings stirred again, waiting to be seen, waiting to rise. The sound that came from the tomb was not loud, but it was deep, a vibration that seemed to move through the sand and into the bones. Nephrit and Penihasse stood frozen, their oil lamps flickering wildly as grains of dust began to rise from the ground. It was as though the air itself had turned to water, rippling around them. The golden vessel at the center of the chamber pulsed faintly with light. Penihasse reached out a trembling hand, stopping just before touching it. "Do you feel that?" he whispered. Nephrit nodded, her voice caught in her throat. It was not merely sound. It was presence. From somewhere deep within the walls, a faint humming began to build. Not like chanting this time, but like breath. The hieroglyphs carved into the stone seemed to shimmer, their edges glowing softly before fading again. Penihasse stumbled back, clutching his chest. "It's the resonance of the old tongue," he said, his voice cracking. They believed the words themselves had life, that they could summon what they described. His eyes met hers, full of fear and awe. "We've awakened memory itself." Outside, the horizon turned an eerie shade of red. The morning sun, usually golden, was filtered through a fine layer of dust kicked up by the desert winds. The workers gathered near their tents, whispering nervously. Some refused to go near the tomb. Others claimed they heard voices calling their names from beneath the sand. A few packed their belongings and fled before noon. When Nephrit went to reassure them, one of the older workers, his eyes wide with terror, grabbed her wrist and said, "You think you found a tomb, but you've dug into a god's dream, and dreams should not be disturbed." Meanwhile, in Thebes, Pharaoh Seti II received word of strange tremors near the valley. His advisors dismissed it as shifting ground from the storm, but said he felt a growing pull in his chest, as if something from that place was calling to him. That night, he dreamed again. He stood on the banks of the Nile, its surface black as obsidian. Across the river stood a figure, tall and robed in gold, its face hidden beneath a mask shaped like a falcon's head. The figure raised a hand, and the river turned crimson beneath the moonlight. When Seti tried to speak, the figure's voice echoed inside his skull. "You are my reflection. What you awaken awakens you." He jolted awake, gasping, his palms slick with sweat. Unable to shake the dream, he summoned Meritnith from her temple. When she arrived, her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with sleepless shadows. "You've seen it too," she said softly. Seti hesitated, then nodded. "What does it mean?" he asked. Meritnith's gaze drifted toward the open window where the Nile shimmered faintly in the moonlight. "It means the balance is shifting," she murmured. "The barrier between mortal and divine is weakening. The rites we performed were meant to preserve that line. But something or someone has crossed it." Penihaci and Nefret, unaware of the Pharaoh's vision, pressed on with their study. The light within the tomb had faded, leaving only a faint trace of warmth near the vessel. Penihaci decided to seal the chamber again, fearing what they might have disturbed. But before they could leave, Nefret noticed something that stopped her cold. New symbols had appeared around the vessel overnight. They were fresh, the lines sharp and dark. And at the center of the new inscription was a name neither of them had ever seen before: Seti. Her breath caught. "Penihaci, how could this be?" she asked, her voice trembling. "These carvings are thousands of years old." Penihaci stared at the name, his expression unreadable. "Unless," he whispered, "time itself has begun to fold. The tomb is no longer remembering the past. It's reflecting the present." That evening, when Nefret returned to her tent, she found a small clay amulet lying on her cot. It was shaped like an eye, the eye of Horus, but cracked down the center. No one in the camp claimed to have left it. She slipped it into her satchel uneasily. Later, as she tried to sleep, she dreamed of the same red river Seti had seen, though she had never been told of it. She saw figures chanting in the water, their faces hidden, their hands raised toward a golden light rising from the depths. When she awoke, her hands were covered in fine grains of sand, as if she'd been digging in her sleep. In the royal court, Seti's behavior grew erratic. He began holding private audiences with the priests, demanding translations of forbidden hymns that hadn't been recited in centuries. His advisors grew fearful. They said he was becoming obsessed with the idea of merging with the gods completely, of transcending his mortal form. "The people must see me as divine," he told Meritnith one night, pacing before the temple's great pillars. "If I become the storm, the kingdom will endure forever." She looked at him with quiet dread. "And if you fail?" she asked. He stopped, turning to her slowly. "Then Egypt falls with me." Back in the desert, Penihaci grew weaker by the day. The hum within the tomb returned each night, and it seemed to drain his strength. He confessed to Nefret that he had once been a temple scholar in Thebes, years ago, and had fled after uncovering similar texts that hinted at the living rites. "They called it blasphemy," he said, his voice faint. But the truth was far more dangerous. The old kings believed that through sacred acts, they could touch eternity. They thought they could sustain the cycle forever. But it came with a price: madness, famine, drought. Every time the line was crossed, Egypt suffered. As he spoke, a low rumble echoed through the valley. Nefret ran outside, her eyes widening as she saw fissures forming in the ground near the tomb's entrance. The air shimmered again, heavy with the same strange energy. From within the cracks came a faint golden glow, pulsing like a heartbeat. The workers who remained dropped their tools and fell to their knees, praying aloud. One of them cried out, "The gods are returning." But Nefret's instincts screamed otherwise. Something wasn't returning, something was being released. That night, the pharaoh left Thebes under the cover of darkness, accompanied by a small group of guards and priests. He was drawn to the valley, though no one could explain why. When he arrived at the excavation site at dawn, Nefert and Pinehasi were waiting for him, stunned to see the ruler of Egypt standing before the half-buried tomb. "This place calls to me," Seti said, his voice distant, almost reverent. "It knows my name." Pinehasi tried to stop him. "Your Majesty, it is not a place of worship. It is a warning. The one who entered here long ago tried to become immortal, and his kingdom turned to dust." But Seti's gaze was fixed on the glowing fissure. "Then perhaps he did not try hard enough," he said quietly. Nefert felt a chill run through her. "If you step inside," she whispered, "you'll wake whatever lies beyond." Seti looked at her, his eyes strangely calm. "It's already awake," he said. The wind began to howl through the valley again, swirling sand around them in spirals. The golden vessel in the tomb gave off a brilliant pulse of light, illuminating the chamber from within. For a heartbeat, Nefert saw shapes moving in the glow, tall, shadowy figures, their eyes glimmering like molten gold. And just as quickly, the light vanished, plunging everything into silence. When her vision cleared, the fissure had closed. The tomb was still, but the pharaoh was gone. The desert stretched out before them, empty, endless, and silent, as though it had swallowed him whole. And in that moment, Nefert understood that whatever they had awakened was no longer contained in stone or ritual. It was free. The whispers of the old gods had found a new voice. And Egypt's balance between heaven, earth, and man had just been broken. The desert was silent, unnaturally so, as if even the wind feared to move. The sun had begun to rise, soft and gold at first, before darkening behind a thin veil of dust. Nefert stood frozen at the edge of the fissure where Pharaoh Seti II had vanished. Her heart pounded in her chest, echoing the memory of the hum that had filled the tomb. Pinehasi, pale and trembling, knelt beside her. He pressed his hands against the sand and whispered prayers in the old language, the one used only for the dead. When he looked up, his eyes were hollow. "He's crossed over," he said, "but not into death." Nefert could hardly speak. "Then where?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Pinehasi's gaze shifted toward the horizon, where the dunes shimmered faintly in the morning light. "Into what the ancients called the Duat," he murmured. "The space between the worlds, where gods dream and kings are remade." The camp was in chaos. The remaining workers had fled in panic, some swearing they saw shadows moving beneath the sand. Others claiming the sky itself had whispered their names. Nefert and Pinehasi were left alone with the tomb. The air around it shimmered, thick with a strange vibration that made the hair on Nefert's arms rise. It was as if the entire valley had begun to breathe, inhaling and exhaling through the cracks in the earth. For days, they searched for signs of the pharaoh. They found none, but the more time they spent near the tomb, the more both began to change. Pinehasi's voice grew softer, his skin pale, and his dreams filled with symbols, spirals of gold, serpents devouring their tails, and eyes watching from behind walls of sand. Nefert found herself sketching these same shapes in her journal without realizing it, her hands moving as though guided by something unseen. The connection between them and whatever had been awakened was growing stronger. In Thebes, word of the pharaoh's disappearance spread quietly, hidden beneath layers of official denial. The priests told the people that Seti had gone on a retreat to commune with the gods. But among the high council, panic simmered. Without a living ruler, Egypt was vulnerable. And though the temples performed their daily rituals, the Nile's waters began to recede unnaturally fast, leaving patches of cracked earth along its banks. Crops withered, and the priests of Ammonius whispered that the river was withdrawing its blessing. Something sacred had been broken. Meritnith remained in her temple chambers, refusing to leave. Each night, she heard faint footsteps in the halls, though no one was there. The air smelled faintly of incense and sand. When she tried to sleep, she dreamt of the pharaoh standing on the edge of the underworld, his body glowing with gold, his voice echoing like thunder. He spoke words she didn't understand, but the tone was not human. It was as if Egypt itself were speaking through him. When she awoke, she found a thin line of red dust across her floor, the same color as the valley earth. Back in the desert, Nefert began to notice small changes in the environment. The nights were no longer cool, but unnervingly warm, as if the air itself retained the energy of the buried chamber. Some mornings, she woke to find her tools rearranged, her notes turned to pages she hadn't yet written on. Penihasse grew distant, often standing near the tomb for hours without speaking. One afternoon, she found him inside, tracing the symbols on the wall with his fingertips. "It's rewriting itself again," he said softly. The hieroglyphs glowed faintly as he spoke, new lines etching across the stone in real time. "It's not history," he murmured. "It's prophecy." "What does it say?" Nefert asked, stepping closer. Penihasse hesitated before answering. "The king returns when the two worlds merge. But if he returns incomplete, the Nile will turn to dust." He looked at her gravely. "We must find a way to seal it again before he crosses back." That night, the moon rose full over the valley, casting long, trembling shadows. Nefert sat outside her tent, staring at the horizon. She felt torn between awe and dread. Egypt's kings had always been seen as divine, but what if that divinity was not symbolic? What if it was literal, a dangerous inheritance passed down through ritual and belief, waiting for the right moment to awaken again? Suddenly, the ground beneath her shifted. The sand trembled, and from deep within the tomb came a low sound. Not a hum this time, but a heartbeat. She ran toward the chamber, shouting for Penihasse. He was already there, his face pale in the moonlight. The golden vessel glowed again, brighter than before, and a faint mist began to rise from it, coiling upward like smoke. Penihasse tried to chant a sealing prayer, but his words faltered as the mist took form. It shimmered, twisting into the outline of a man, tall, regal, and cloaked in gold dust. "Seti," Nefert whispered, but it wasn't the pharaoh's voice that answered. The figure turned toward her, and though its features were familiar, its eyes burned with something vast and ancient. "He has seen what no mortal should see," the voice said, echoing as if spoken from within the earth. "And now he carries what no king should bear." The form flickered, the light around it pulsing in rhythm with the heartbeat that filled the chamber. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it collapsed into dust, leaving the vessel cracked and dim. Penihasse fell to his knees, gasping for breath. "It's too late," he said. "The return has begun." Over the next few days, the valley grew darker, though the sun still shone. The light seemed dimmer, more brittle. The sand no longer reflected gold, but a dull, lifeless gray. Animals fled the area. Nefert barely slept, haunted by flashes of images she couldn't explain. A throne floating above water, a hand reaching through flame, an eye watching from beneath the surface of the Nile. Each morning, she found more new symbols carved into the walls of the tomb. They were forming a story, one of ascension, fall, and rebirth. Meanwhile, in Thebes, a strange figure appeared near the temple gates. Dressed in torn robes, but carrying himself with the bearing of a king, he claimed to bring a message from the gods. When the guards tried to stop him, the torches around them went out one by one. Meritnith, sensing something familiar, ordered that he be brought inside. When she saw him, her breath caught. His face was weathered, his eyes glowing faintly like molten gold. "Seti," she whispered, but he did not answer her by name. "Egypt must be reborn," he said instead. "The gods sleep no longer." Back in the valley, Nefert and Penihasse prepared to leave, believing their work cursed. Yet as they packed their things, a royal envoy arrived bearing the pharaoh's seal, commanding them to return to Thebes. Nefert felt her blood run cold. "But the pharaoh is gone," she said. The messenger only bowed. "His majesty awaits you," he replied. Penihasse met her eyes. "If he truly returned," he said quietly, "then he is not the same man." As they began the journey back to Thebes, the winds rose again, carrying faint whispers across the dunes. Nefert couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, reverent, sorrowful, and heavy with warning. She turned once more to the valley and saw, for For just a moment, a faint glow from beneath the sand, the tomb's light pulsing like a buried heart. And in the capital, where the temple bells rang and the priests prayed for balance, the man who now sat upon the golden throne smiled faintly as the river outside turned darker still, as though Egypt itself was holding its breath for what was coming next. The ride back to Thebes was long and silent. The horizon shimmered under the burning sky, and each mile brought Nefret closer to the truth she wasn't ready to face. Panihasi sat beside her, his expression unreadable. The only sound was the steady crunch of the camel's hooves in the sand and the low whistle of the wind. Both knew that what awaited them was not the Egypt they had left behind. Something had shifted, something ancient and vast. When the city's outline finally appeared, it looked almost unreal. The spires of temples and the walls of palaces gleamed faintly under the haze. But as they entered the gates, the air felt wrong, thick, heavy, filled with tension. People moved quietly through the streets, their eyes downcast, their voices hushed. Soldiers in bronze armor lined the avenues leading to the palace, and though the banners fluttered as they always had, there was no music, no laughter. Egypt had become silent. Nefret's pulse quickened when she saw the palace courtyard. The great doors were open, guarded by men whose faces she didn't recognize. When she and Panihasi were led inside, the scent of incense hit her immediately, sweet but mixed with the faint smell of dust and metal. The throne room was dim, lit by oil lamps that cast wavering shadows across the golden walls. And there, seated upon the throne, was Pharaoh Seti II. At first glance, he looked unchanged, still regal, still commanding. But when he turned his head, the illusion broke. His skin had a faint, unnatural glow, and his eyes seemed to reflect light that wasn't there. He smiled when he saw Nefret. "You have returned," he said, his voice calm but distant. "You have seen what others were never meant to see." Nefret bowed her head, but her voice was steady. "My king," she said, "we feared you lost." The tomb, he interrupted softly, was a doorway, not an end. "I have walked the duet and returned with knowledge that will restore Egypt." He rose slowly from the throne, his golden cloak brushing the marble floor. "The gods have shown me the balance of life and death. The Nile will flow as it once did. Our kingdom will rise higher than ever before." But Panihasi stepped forward, his tone sharp. "At what cost, Pharaoh?" he asked. "You were not meant to return from the duet. No mortal can walk that path unchanged. What did you bring back with you?" For a moment, the room darkened, as if a shadow passed over the sun. The pharaoh's smile faltered, and his gaze turned cold. "You doubt the will of the gods?" he said. "You of all people should understand that power demands sacrifice." Nefret's breath caught as she realized the truth. The golden vessel had not only been a relic, it had been a prison. Whatever had crossed back through the tomb was not entirely Seti anymore. His voice carried the echo of something else, something older. She remembered the hieroglyphs that had appeared on the tomb's walls, the prophecy Panihasi had read aloud. The king returns when the two worlds merge. That was the cost. Seti had brought the two realms closer. And now, their boundaries were fading. Outside, thunder rolled across the desert sky, even though no storm clouds were visible. The palace trembled faintly, and the oil lamps flickered as if struggling against a rising wind. The priests in the courtyard fell to their knees, chanting hurried prayers. Nefret turned to Panihasi, who was already reciting words of protection under his breath. "We can't fight him," she whispered, "but maybe we can guide him back." They approached slowly, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of confusion in the pharaoh's eyes. "Nefret," he said, his tone softer, "you have always served Egypt faithfully. You must understand, I am its future." "You are Egypt," she replied gently, "but Egypt cannot live between two worlds. The gods gave us life to walk this one, not both." She stepped closer, tears welling in her eyes. "You were chosen to rule, not to carry the burden of eternity." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his hand trembled, and the light in his eyes dimmed. The gold that had seemed to pulse through his veins began to fade. I saw them, he whispered. The ancestors, the gods, the river before time began. They offered me endless rain. I thought I could save us. Nefret shook her head. You already have. Your return showed us that even kings are bound by the same truths as all people, that life's beauty is in its passing. Panihasi began to chant softly, his voice steady and calm. The air grew still. The heartbeat that had echoed faintly since the tomb reopened began to slow. The pharaoh closed his eyes. For a brief moment, the light around him flared, and the scent of lotus flowers filled the air. Then the glow faded completely, leaving only the man behind, mortal, weary, but at peace. When he opened his eyes again, they were no longer golden. He looked at Nefret and smiled faintly. Tell them, he said quietly, that Egypt must remember who she is. Then his head bowed, and the hall fell silent. The following days were filled with mourning, but also renewal. The priest declared that Pharaoh Seti II had ascended to join the gods, his spirit finally at rest. The Nile began to rise again, its waters flowing clean and strong. Crops sprouted where the earth had cracked. The people spoke of miracles, but those who had been closest to the truth said little. Nefret and Panihasi returned once more to the Valley of Kings. The tomb stood open, but the strange hum was gone. Inside, the golden vessel lay shattered, its light extinguished. Nefret ran her hand along the wall where the hieroglyphs had once glowed. They were still now, silent history again. Do you think it's over? She asked quietly. Panihasi looked out toward the horizon where the sun dipped low and turned the desert red. Nothing ends, he said softly. It only changes form. But Egypt is safe for now. As the wind swept through the valley, Nefret felt something lift from her shoulders. The air smelled of sand and life again. She looked at the fading sunlight and thought of the pharaoh, not as a ruler, but as a man who had tried to save his people in the only way he knew. In her later years, when she would write of these events, Nefret never spoke of curses or gods or power. Instead, she wrote of balance, of how every civilization, no matter how mighty, must learn to let go of its need to control the unknown. The story became less about a king who returned from death, and more about the people who chose life, even in the face of eternity. And though the tomb remained sealed forever after, travelers who passed through the valley swore that on certain nights, when the moon was full and the wind carried faint echoes, they could still hear the river's voice whispering through the dunes, steady, eternal, and alive. Egypt endured, not because of the pharaoh's return, but because of the courage of those who faced the darkness and chose to set it free. And so, the kingdom slept again under the stars, wrapped in the golden silence of time, waiting for the next story to rise from the sand.